During the latter part of July in 1990, Oliver Stone, the award-winning director of such films as Platoon and Born on the 4th of July, called me, and as an infrequent moviegoer, I have to admit I had never heard of Oliver Stone and had not seen any of his films. And I was quite surprised by his call, and if I had any idea of what would follow as a result of that call, I'd have headed for the hills. I was to learn again how positively all of us are in the grip of our masters, this anonymous, but we know it's out there, the power elite. Stone said he planned to do a film about Vietnam, about the period and the assassination of President Kennedy as a chronological function of the Vietnam War period. He had read some of my writings already on those subjects back in '85 and '86 and wanted to meet with me during a trip to Washington, and I agreed. And I liked his plans. I accepted his contract for the JFK film production and looked forward to reading the script. What he had read is now contained in my new book, JFK, the CIA, Vietnam, and the Plot to Assassinate Kennedy. I should explain, the book really is a Cold War period book. It begins with items from 1943 and comes right up to 1990. But the Kennedy period cannot be overlooked. It is one of the fundamental incidents of that period. Little did I expect the sheer brutality of the onslaught that followed. As you in the audience know all too well, the moment you state that anything is a result of a conspiracy, you're branded as a crackpot, your reputation is shredded and worse by all kinds of experts, including many from the highest levels of the media of our government. But you know, this is telling us something very important. Even before the final script for Stone's film had been written, before the cameras had begun to roll, major writers for such media giants as the Washington Post, the New York Times, Newsweek began their attacks on Stone. They hadn't seen the movie. They're not film reviewers. One of them, George Lardner from the Post, has for years been that paper's national security columnist. Another was Tom Wicker from the Times. Another was that famous golfer out here in the sunshine at Palm Springs called Gerald Ford. Film critics? Hardly. But boy, they know how to attack. Why such men were so suddenly concerned with a movie? It was not a documentary. It was a full-fledged dramatic production with a moral and designed to awaken the American public with the true facts about the Kennedy assassination. To this end, it was entirely successful. Now, why did men like these and many, many more attack Oliver Stone and myself? We were attacked because we had made it positively clear that the murder of President Kennedy was the result of a massive plot. It was the result of a conspiracy by, to use Winston Churchill's World War II term, the high cabal. Now, I know that all of you understand conspiracy when you see it, and you see it all around you. It's normal and logical for men to work together on plans that they have made. That is a vital corporate function known as planning. However, when the planning process introduces evil, it's no longer simple planning by definition. It becomes conspiracy, and now that's the clear distinction. Lee Harvey Oswald, an individual, must always be charged with the crime of killing President Kennedy to hide the fact of conspiracy. It's possible to allege that an individual committed murder for some mindless, undefined reason and leave it there. In such a case, there need not be a why. An individual doesn't make up a conspiracy, but as soon as there are several plotters, as soon as their plot is built upon evil, we have no alternative than to find for the existence of conspiracy. This is why our major media, all of our major media, must always state that the Warren Commission was correct and that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin of the president. The media have no other option. They're ordered to do that. The sheer nonsense of their stand proves that they're under order. I mean, they're not ignorant. Let's take this a step further. Every president since Kennedy has stated that the Warren Commission report is correct and that Oswald is the lone killer, it becomes obvious that these presidents also are under orders. They have no choice. They too are subservient. It's rather dangerous. It begins to describe what we're living in. There's but one overwhelming answer to all of this. They're all forced to uphold these lies, to uphold that 30-year-old mythology. This is the answer, and that answer is dangerous, and it's a threat to all of us, to our country, to our way of life. The undeniable fact that even presidents are under this duress proves the existence of conspiracy and the nature of the crime. We're being forced to live a lie. The same power elite that made the decision to assassinate Kennedy in 1963 has made similar history-making decisions as far back as 1943 within my own active experience. They exist today in 1993 to carry on the burden of the secret of that coup d'etat of the government of the United States of America that took place on the streets of Dallas in 1963. Now think about that for a minute. I'm not talking about the movie now, and I'm not talking about Jim Garrison and his trial in New Orleans, and I'm not talking about my own books. I'm talking about the mere, simple, horrible fact of conspiracy throughout our lifetimes. As a result of personal experience, I've been documenting this situation since 1943 and 1944. I've covered that in detail in my books, and I won't repeat it here, but if any of you want to see the different points that I may be skipping through here, I would ask you to take a look at the books, because I have gone into it in usually great detail to explain all this. Now let's face this issue head on. This word conspiracy has been a major weapon in the arsenal of modern times. If the public is told repeatedly by authorities, whoever they may be, that certain contrived propaganda is true, it's equally inevitable that other knowledgeable persons will rise to demonstrate that the authorities are wrong and that the facts are otherwise. Then in return, the authorities themselves and their spokesmen will resort to the use of conspiracy as a weapon against those who know the true facts and who are trying to correct the record. The very word conspiracy becomes a weapon. At this point, the authorities, supported on all sides by their minions in the media, government, lawyers, bankers, academia, science, etc., will shriek that their adversaries are paranoid and conspiracy buffs. Today, accusing someone of being a conspiracy buff is just about the dirtiest term that can be used. It rivals in lethality such terms as liberal and anti-American. You just think of the people throwing those things around all the time. I'm not sure they can define them. But we know better. So let's look at the record. As I uncover a number of the concealed facts of our secret history, you know, that's what Oliver Stone called my book. He didn't want that big long name on it. He said, let's just call it The Secret History. I'll go back several decades to trace the course of my own experience in chronological order, to lay the groundwork for the remainder of my talk to you, which is focused directly on the Kennedy problem. I believe the preceding words are necessary because I'm just going to have to use the word conspiracy, and I hope to be doing it in its proper context. And even in this brief historical recapitulation, I'm going to hit only a certain few points and then come right back to the main theme. During the depths of World War II, when it really was unclear whether the Allies would be the victors or whether the Axis powers would be the victors, there were two extremely important conferences before the landings in Normandy. In fact, they led to the timing of the landing in Normandy. The first was the Cairo Conference in Cairo, Egypt, during the latter part of October in 1943. And the second, followed immediately, was the Tehran Conference that followed at the end of October and the early part of November. I happened to be in Cairo at the time President Roosevelt came there. Churchill came in, and Chiang Kai-shek from China. And Chiang Kai-shek, in a very interesting sense, was accompanied by his wife, Mei Ling-sung. And historically, it's very important to go back to that point, because Mei Ling, American educated, very articulate, was the sister of T.V. Soong, who really was the man that moved the strings up here for Chiang Kai-shek down there running China. He, at that time, was the wealthiest man in the world. And it was T.V. Soong's delegates who traveled to Cairo to meet during the conferences with the delegates that Roosevelt had brought there and Churchill. It's an important fact as we look back, say, from the threshold of Vietnam War or the Korean War, and even current times. After this Cairo conference had begun to go, I was given duties. I had a VIP plane. It was a little Lockheed Lodestar, for those that you know of it. It was kind of prettied up, had comfortable seats, even had a little bed in it, and had a typewriter in it, which for those days was pretty special. And every afternoon I would be told that as soon as the conference had ended, I would fly certain delegates to a certain destination, maybe 100, 200 miles away, because they were afraid of the Germans bombing Cairo while the conference was going on, and so they separated everybody in the evenings. Well, I was just a young fellow. I'd been in Egypt a little less than a year. But I suddenly realized that by going back in the cabin and letting my co-pilot fly the plane, I could just about keep up with what was going on in the conference. It was very interesting. They were all talking with each other, and some of them were real mad at Chiang Kai-shek and his people, especially the British, because they didn't agree with the Chinese. Some were mad at Roosevelt, and it was kind of free talk on board, and it was a good education. So I made it a point to go back and kind of listen each day and talk with them. The Cairo conference ended with a decision that you won't find in your history books. First of all, they were making a decision about the development of the war in Europe. Well, obviously, that was why they were there. That was the real reason, and it was the cover story. But in addition to that, prior to the Cairo conference in October, the same month, wait, I'm a month off. The conference is the end of November and December. In October, Roosevelt had sent a geological survey team to the country we knew as violently neutral, Saudi Arabia, for the purpose of looking into the oil franchises that were held there by the California Standard Oil Company, and whether or not some of that oil could be made available quickly for the war, because we needed it so badly. There were times when Patton's army had run out of oil during the war, and it was a good thing they planned ahead. There were times when the Soviet army ran out of oil. There were times when the Germans did. They were using so much petroleum for both aircraft and tanks. So one of the most important decisions of the war and the post-war period was made right there in Cairo, when, after hearing this geological survey team report on the enormous amount of oil that was in Saudi Arabia, no matter what the rationing was here in the United States on production, Roosevelt ordered the immediate construction of a 50,000 barrel a day refinery on the shores of the Persian Gulf on the edge of Saudi Arabia. And you might say that marks the beginning of one of the most profitable enterprises ever set up by man, the Aramco company, which has been extracting oil now from Saudi Arabia ever since that day. So wars are fought for political reasons, military reasons, and for the post-war, profitable reasons. The Cairo conference ended, and immediately, the next morning, I was told to fly a group to Tehran. I didn't know it was going to be a Tehran conference. And as I went out to the plane in the morning and was getting ready to go, here came two limousines from the city, and they were filled with Chinese gentlemen. And I was introduced to them, and they, again, were Chiang Kai-shek's delegation, who were T.V. Soong's people. And I flew the Chinese to Tehran. En route, I stopped at Habbaniyah in Iraq for refueling. And while I was on the ground, a B-25 came in with an old friend of mine flying it, and with Elliot Roosevelt, the president's son. While we were on the ground, I introduced Roosevelt to the Chinese and vice versa. And I don't know whether any of you ever realize, years later, the fact that Elliot Roosevelt had gone to the Tehran conference brought up one of the most amazing facts in our history, and I don't know why more has not been said about it. Because he knew Stalin, having met him at Tehran with his father, the Look magazine editors asked him to interview Stalin later. I think it was in the 50s, but I can't tell you. It might have been a little later than that. But anyway, this is all in writing, and you can certainly pick it out of your library or microfilm library, whatever. And so he went to Moscow, and he interviewed Stalin. And at the end of the interview, he said, I would like to ask you a personal question, Marshal Stalin. He said, why is it that my mother has never been permitted to Moscow, even though she has made 3 very serious formal applications for the trip to Moscow? Stalin said, you don't know why? And he said, no. He said, do you know who killed your father? And Roosevelt was shocked. He said, no. So Stalin said, well, I'll tell you why I have not invited her here. He said, as soon as your father died, I asked my ambassador in Washington to go immediately to Georgia and to view the body, because Stalin felt that if he could see the body, that Gromyko could, it would be discolored, black, from poison. So Elliot said that he knew nothing about that, and Stalin said, your mother refused to open the lid of the coffin so that my ambassador could see the body. He said, I sent Gromyko back. I sent him 3 times trying to impress upon your mother that it was very important for my ambassador to view the president. He said, she never accepted that. He said, so that's why I don't let her into Moscow. So Elliot was forced to ask the next question. How do you know? Or why did you think that he was poisoned? He said Stalin got up from behind his desk, walked around the office, and almost in a rage said, because they killed him. Who killed my father? The Churchill gang. Now, that's in print, Parade magazine, signed by Elliot Roosevelt. I can't explain it any further than that, and I don't know why that story doesn't recapitulate through history in our history books with some kind of an explanation, but I'll tell you, it's a stunning bit of information. Roosevelt died at age 63, Stalin died at age 75, Churchill died at 92. I think there's a lot of benefit in brandy and cigars, but other than that. But you know, those are amazing stories that we don't find in history, and that's what I'm trying to say here. We don't find in history that Roosevelt made the decision to open up the oil fields for commercial production as soon as the war was over at Cairo. And then when we got up to Tehran, Stalin was there, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Chiang Kai-shek. Go to your library or any other source you want to pick and see if you can find me a book that tells you, any history book, foreign or United States, that tells you that Chiang Kai-shek had gone to the Tehran Conference. Now, it may not sound as though it's very important, but it is when we start thinking about it. We were allied as a partnership with the Soviet Union. We were allied closely with England, of course, against the Axis, which was Germany, Italy, and Japan, until Italy surrendered, and then it was just Germany and Japan. Chiang Kai-shek was our ally. But in the eyes of Stalin, he's a dictator and an anti-communist dictator, because at the same time he's fighting World War II, he's fighting Mao Zedong in China, who is a communist ally of, and close ideological ally of the Soviets. And this made that meeting of the 4 powers, it was necessary to get the 4 powers together for world opinion, but it means that the meeting of the 4 powers was very fragile, very complex. And so historians have not faced up to the fact that that needs explanation. What they finally did is agree to meet, and the Allied powers agreed to move the date of the invasion of Normandy up to June of '44, while Stalin agreed to talk to Mao Zedong and have him halt any attacks on Chiang, so Chiang could devote all his strength on the Japanese, whom he'd been fighting since 1931, by the way, so that we could move aircraft into China and bomb Japan and win the war against Japan. So a very important decision, but we came to that decision in Tehran because Chiang Kai-shek was there. And only 3 days after that decision, No, not after that decision. 3 days after the landing at Normandy on June 6, 1945, 44, getting all screwed up here. Our bombers first hit Japan. And a week after that, Mao Zedong made a big talk about how he was supporting Chiang Kai-shek in his great battle against Japan and all that. In other words, all this behind-the-scenes history began to unfold and leads us to the next step of the way, you might say. Because at the Tehran Conference, they made plans for the post-war Far East. And I'll jump to an interesting date. That on the 2nd of September in 1945, the Japanese surrendered. On the 2nd of September 1945, U.S. General Gallagher, OSS man Lou Konin, and Ho Chi Minh stood on a platform in Hanoi while Ho Chi Minh read the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam, and in the harbor of Haiphong, U.S. transports were arriving with 1/2 of the 500,000-man arm pack that was going to support the invasion of Japan that we didn't have to do because Japan had surrendered before the invasion. So all these arms had been piled up on Okinawa for the invasion. They were cut in half, and this is 45. Half went to Korea, to Syngman Rhee. Half went to Hanoi, to Ho Chi Minh. Who, in those days, years before these things happened, would have predicted that somebody made a decision in 45, or perhaps in 43 at Tehran, to provide the Koreans with sufficient armament to create their own South Korean government, which had never existed before, and to arm Ho Chi Minh, ostensibly so he could round up the remaining Japanese, but to begin his drive for a separate nation in Vietnam. Very interesting history that I don't know where you're going to find it in any book. But I was stationed on Okinawa. At that time, I had been in Japan as early as the 1st of September in 45. In my book, there's pictures of me standing at Atsugi Air Base on that date. By the way, Atsugi's where Lee Harvey Oswald served with the CIA when he was a Marine. And one reason I put the picture in the book. But you see how planning is done at these top levels. And yet newspapermen, and Cairo was overrun with them, and Tehran was overrun with them, don't seem to get it in the reports, and historians reviewing these things don't get the reports. I have a government printing office recapitulation of the history of the time in which it says that Chiang Kai-shek and Roosevelt were in Tehran. One book. Try to find another one. It's very interesting, not so much for the material that I'm talking about, but for the process. What is it that decides that you can know what our history is, and then you can't know what some of the rest of our history is? It seems to be a continuing business. So we always are fighting for the record, one way or the other. And I'll never forget the morning in, I think it was June 1971, when I opened up the New York Times and I learned the name Ellsberg and the words Pentagon Papers and classified documents. For on that date, this young man named Ellsberg had delivered something like 4,000 documents, I think a total of 7,000 pages, mostly said to be top secret, on the doorsteps of the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and perhaps a few other papers. And immediately after that, he was charged with the crime of revealing top secret information, etc., and all that. But what it did is a very clever bit of work. It made all of us believe that, well, if these are the real government documents, then they must be true. And so we have finally got a block of history that is true. Ellsberg gave us the truth right here. Now, what did the papers cover? Well, as we go back and review the story, McNamara is said to have established this group of people to do the history during the Kennedy-McNamara-Johnson period, which began, of course, in 61 through to about 68, of the Vietnam War. A complete recapitulation of the Vietnam War as the Defense Department saw it. In fact, they went to the trouble of saying we were not permitted to use papers from the White House and that sort of thing, or from the CIA. So you get the feeling that, by golly, we've got the basic papers here. This is the truth. And so most people who study the Vietnam War, no matter how many books they read, they have the Pentagon Papers over here and they kind of check through those records. Let me give you an example of what the Pentagon Papers say. When you get up to the 20th of November, 1963, they report that there was a conference, a very important conference in Honolulu, to discuss recent plans for Vietnam. Because Kennedy, in October of 63, had signed a most important National Security Action Memorandum, which stated, among other things, that he was bringing 1,000 men home by Christmas and that all U.S. personnel would be out of Vietnam by the end of 65. Now that hit like a ton of bricks everywhere. So the meeting on the 20th of November was to bring that up to date, because in the interim between that policy statement and the 20th of November, Ngo Dinh Diem, the first president of South Vietnam, had been assassinated, and there was a possibility that the new government would not be strong enough to stand on its feet as Kennedy had figured it would be when he made his October decision. So they wanted to take a good look at things. And so Ambassador Lodge and his staff came in from Saigon, and about 60 people from Washington, all experts in Vietnam, went to Honolulu for the meeting. That's November 20th. And the Pentagon Papers do a pretty good job of presenting that. On the 21st, they note that the conference ended and that Defense Secretary McNamara and the National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy and a few others headed for home. But on the 21st, the Kennedy cabinet had arrived. Almost the entire cabinet. I think it was the entire cabinet, give or take the fact that McNamara was going back to Washington. And on the 22nd, in this chronology that is in the Pentagon Papers, it tells that the cabinet was en route to Tokyo. Is there anything in any of the reading you've done that ever tells you that the cabinet of the United States have been en route together in any foreign country or to any foreign country? A very strange thing to happen on the very day that Kennedy died. So then you drop down one more line item in the Pentagon Papers. We're following its own chronology. And on the 22nd of November, 1963, this complete 5-volume review of the Vietnam War history states Ambassador Lodge flew to Washington to meet the president. Now, who was president? On November 22nd, 1963, Lyndon Johnson became President of the United States of America. They don't say anything about that. On that same date, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. That's not in the Pentagon Papers. On November 26, 1963, President Johnson signed a National Security Action Memorandum, as high level a paper as you can get from the White House, especially on national security affairs, number 273. And this was guidance for future Vietnam plans and policy. This brief directive most significantly initiated changes reversing Kennedy's Vietnam policy stated on October 11th, that document NSAM 263. Kennedy had decreed then that the bulk of U.S. personnel would be out of Vietnam by the end of 1965. When I put that material into the script of Stone's film, immediately from the New York Times, from Gerald Ford, former President Ford, and many other writers, we got the general reaction that the film was wrong. There is no substantive history to support Kennedy ever planned to take, not to put Americans into Vietnam. You can't all see this, but this is the front page of the worldwide Stars and Stripes newspaper printed by the military, for the military, all over the world. It is dated October 4th, 1963, and it has Kennedy's words that U.S. troops seen out of Vietnam by 65. Now that's only the military paper. All the other papers, the civilian papers, and around the world carried the same huge headline. There is no doubt about the historical significance of the document signed by Kennedy, and then there's no doubt about this strange document that Johnson signed only 4 days after Kennedy's death, beginning, rather cautiously, but beginning the change of the Kennedy policy, despite what people say. It's a fact. Strangely, this new 273, which began the change in Kennedy's policy toward Vietnam, was drafted on November 21st, 1963, obviously the day before Kennedy died. It was not Kennedy policy. He would not have signed it, and he wouldn't have requested it in the first place. He did not intend to change his policy. Why would it have been drafted for his signature on the day before he died? And why would it have been given to Johnson so quickly after Kennedy died? Johnson hadn't asked for it. On November 21st, 1963, I'm positive Johnson had no expectation whatsoever of being president on the 26th. On November 29th, 1963, President Johnson met with J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, to discuss the list of names that had been compiled for the commission to investigate the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And those are important words. Whenever murder is committed in the United States, there has to be a trial in the state where the murder takes place. That's the law of the land. If somebody dies on a train while it's moving, one of the first things they do is say, where was that train when that person died? What state? And that's where you have to try, not just investigate the murder. That's one of the first errors they made. The men that were on the list, and it's an interesting group, were Chief Justice Earl Warren, chairman. Warren did not want the job, fought to get off of it. And in one of his little post-president statements, Johnson said, I had to use a little strong arm to get the Chief Justice on the committee. Kind of amazing statement coming from former president. Another man was Representative Gerald Ford, and Hale Boggs, Senator Richard Russell from Georgia, Senator John Sherman Cooper of Kentucky, John McCloy, a New York banker, Allen Dulles, formerly Director of Central Intelligence, Jacob Javits of New York, and General Lawrence Nordstadt of the U.S. Air Force. All were approved to serve on the commission except the last two, who for reasons unknown did not serve with that body. I have been told that Nordstadt didn't because they didn't want any connection whatsoever in any way between the military and the death of the president. But he did not serve. He was on the original list, and you can see it. By the way, what I'm reading from or quoting from are papers that are available to any of you through Freedom of Information Act and are in my own files, and I'm very familiar with them, and many of them, because of the work I used to have, I had when they were original working papers. I didn't have to, I've never used FOIA in my life, but I have all this stuff. Johnson and Hoover, it's interesting to note, were old friends who had lived across the street from each other in Washington for 19 years. They understood each other, they needed each other. As recorded in a memorandum for the record written by Hoover on that date, I'm talking about November 29th now, and copied for 8 of his senior FBI deputies, Lyndon Johnson, who had been in the third car behind Kennedy in the Dallas motorcade, took advantage of this first White House meeting after the Kennedy ceremonies and burial to ask his old friend some personal questions that had caused him great concern since the assassination. He asked, these are interesting, quote, how many shots were fired? Of course, by that time, the papers were full of the fact that Oswald had an old Italian rifle and had 3 bullets. But anyway, how many shots were fired? Hoover told him 3. Then Johnson asked if any had been fired at him. The people that think Johnson was connected with this, I'd like to see how they trace that feeling with that question. Were any of those shots fired at him? Now, why would he notice that? Because most of us know by now that some of the shots were fired from very close to the ground. So between one of the buildings behind the motorcade, the Daltex building, and Kennedy's car, they would have cleared Johnson's head probably by about 18 inches. And any old infantryman in the crowd will know that 18 inches teaches you quite a bit of a lesson. You pull your head down pretty far. Hoover answered to this question about if any were fired at Johnson and said, quote, "No, 3 shots were fired at the president, and we have them. The president was hit by the first and third bullets, and the second hit the governor, hit Governor Connolly of Texas." That's the end quote. Now, this statement was patently wrong because by that date, they had photographic evidence that one stray bullet hit a curbstone 1.5 blocks away, and the fragment wounded a bystander. There were pictures of the bystander with blood running down his face, and a cameraman, a professional newspaper cameraman, was smart enough to right away take a picture of the curbstone with the nick on it and all that sort of thing. The curbstone was gone the next day. That bullet that missed, of course, was either the 4th shot or it was the cause of this contrived theory about the magic bullet that allegedly hit Kennedy and then flew into Connolly and went all around, because they had to have one bullet do that, because with only 3 bullets and 1 missed, they had to shrink it back to a 3-bullet total. 1 missed and 2 bullets injured both, killed Kennedy and injured Connolly. That's how that had to have been done, and the magic bullet lives with us yet. This discussion between 2 old friends, which took place on November 29th, 1 week after President Kennedy's assassination, is important. It reveals the deep concern of President Johnson. He heard those bullets pass over his head. He never forgot that sound, and it's significant. He had been educated at Dealey Plaza. By that I mean he had lost freedom to be a completely operative president. In early June of 1971, a few days after the Pentagon Papers appeared in the New York Times, and there's no significance between the two, I'm simply fixing it chronologically, Leo Janus, formerly of the White House staff, attended a luncheon in the private dining room of the Johnson Library in Texas with the ailing ex-president and other old friends. As Janus reported later in the Atlantic Monthly magazine of July 1973, and I really urge all of you to dig that out of the library. And by the way, don't take this month's out. They chopped me to death, and they shouldn't be doing that. And Oliver Stone and Jim Garrison, it's dreadful stuff. But anyhow, in this magazine of July 73, there appears this quote written by Janus. During coffee, the talk turned to President Kennedy, and Johnson expressed his belief that the assassination in Dallas had been part of a conspiracy. Now, this is the same President Johnson that established the Warren Commission. It had been part of a conspiracy. He never believed that Oswald acted alone, although he could accept that he pulled a trigger, one of a group. End quote. Johnson followed that with a statement that had the megaton force of a full-size hydrogen bomb. He said, and Janus wrote, quote, "We had been operating a damn murder incorporated in the Caribbean," unquote. Now that was June 1971. Johnson died in January 73, and the Janus article appears in July 73. And since that date, with those words of, one, the man who had established the Warren Commission report itself, the man who was in the motorcade behind Kennedy, and the man who as president became privy to the darkest secrets of the government, we all know that it should have become clear to everyone by now that Kennedy was killed as a result of a massive conspiracy by a team of professional killers following a consensual decision from the highest levels of power in the country, perhaps, to say this in more modern one-world terms, the highest level of power in the world. Clearly, by late 1963, the decision had been made, first, that Kennedy had to be deprived of re-election. In Washington in those days, and I'd been working there then for 9 straight years, this business of stop Kennedy and not have him be re-elected was very important. The Goldwater campaign and a lot of other things was really moving. The second one was that Kennedy had to go, one way or the other. And a third one, all of them kind of look into the future, was that a Kennedy dynasty had to be thwarted. Bobby was right behind him, Teddy was right behind him, and then a whole string of kids forever. The fact of conspiracy, underscored by President Johnson himself, makes it clear that the report of the Warren Commission, which maintains that one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, with a mail-order rifle and 3 bullets, killed John F. Kennedy and severely wounded Governor John B. Connally at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, is totally false. It's contrived. The report of the Warren Commission has been used to provide the lifeblood of a massive cover story that has been kept alive for decades to brainwash generations of Americans and others around the world. It itself perpetuates this American coup d'etat. A case can be made for no conspiracy when it can be proved that one man did it. As soon as more than one man is involved, the senseless act of a lone nut can no longer be used as an excuse. Conspiracy is evidence of malice and evil plan, as I've said above. These points are topped by the belief that we had been operating this murder incorporated. This fact defines the nature of the crime, and it is extremely important, especially today. Note Johnson's words. He said, quote, "We had been operating." The "we" has to mean the United States government, or at least an agency or instrumentality of the government. Some of the things this government does are done on sort of a contract basis or a proprietary basis just for this purpose, so the government can say, oh, we had nothing to do with it, like they did during the Senator Church hearings in the Senate during the 70s. They told the senators that CIA would never assassinate anybody. And what they meant was that the CIA didn't do it, but proprietary interests, they didn't want to bring the subject up. But later, they had to recant and admit that they had taken part in that they had caused assassinations. But it's these words, the way they're played, means an awful lot. By saying also that we had been operating the murder capability over time, he doesn't limit its work to a single event, the Kennedy murder. And that's very important. He remembers back through the years, probably back all the way to World War II, to the uncounted times when enemies of the government have been killed by this murder incorporated, quickly, cleanly, and with precision, and without their apprehension and prosecution by anyone. This is the nature of a government-sponsored hitman professional operation that exists. Johnson chose this mafia term, murder incorporated, to describe what he meant. This choice of words has really great significance. Teams of professional hitmen are recruited, trained, equipped, and provided with a complex of real-life identities by this government in order that they may live this strange existence as normal individuals. They're always available for these special duties anywhere and against any target. One world operation. They're skilled automatons who are set in motion by a code system that does not require the identities of those who have made, quote, the decision. Johnson goes a step further. He calls this unit Murder Incorporated. As we know, a corporate body is eternal, if desired. These murder teams belong to an organization that is, in a special sense, timeless. Such murders are not arranged and carried out on an ad hoc basis. We'll give you $5,000 and go shoot Joe. This is a continuing thing. The teams are prepared and ready at any time. Now, with this in mind, let me go just a step further. I don't know whether or not you saw the Stone film, JFK. I don't know what you thought about it if you did. I do know, though, that for tens of millions around the world who did see it, that the Man X Jim Garrison scene in the mall near the Vietnam Memorial was a climax. It was an awakening for loads of people. And these audiences in those packed theaters began to see and to believe that the lies and the mythology they've been spoon-fed for decades by the government's report of the Warren Commission and by our subservient media was, and still is, false. With this in mind, it is time to face reality. What caught their attention was the simple question in that movie, why? Why was President John F. Kennedy killed? To understand the reasons for this decision, why this decision had been made, we need to take a rather quick but penetrating look at the Kennedy era. Now, so much has taken place since then. So much has happened to each one of us since then. We may not remember the details. We've been misled by the media and by a flood of books that are not really true history. And perhaps, even though we might have been around in those days, we may have just never known. At the time Kennedy was elected in November '60, I was an Air Force colonel assigned to the immediate office of the Secretary of Defense, who then was Thomas Gates. I had been in the Pentagon for 6 consecutive years. All had been spent as Chief of Operations. In military terminology, that means the support of clandestine operations of the CIA. I was with headquarters of the Air Force from 1955 to 1960. I was with the Secretary of Defense from '60 to '62, and with the Office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from '62 and '63. The Eisenhower period of '53 to '60 was one of prosperity, featured by the buildup of the massive military-industrial complex as one of the greatest concentrations of raw power and enormous wealth in the history of the world. We should all know Eisenhower's farewell address of January 17, 1961, 2 days before Kennedy was inaugurated. In this, he documented the concentration of power in the military-industrial complex, a term that he coined in this speech. Quote, "The conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. In the councils of government, we must guard against this acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted." And as I read that to you from the president who preceded Kennedy, and as I read earlier to you the statements of Kennedy, of Johnson going back, you can see where the president before Kennedy and the one after Kennedy tell us more about that assassination openly than you'll read in any of the books you've read on the subject. Like Lyndon Johnson, General Eisenhower was a man who knew. He was telling the American public about these things the way they are. The United States had been involved covertly in the warfare in Southeast Asia since September 1945. We had been involved in Korea since 1945 and in warfare there during the early 50s. By the end of the 8-year Eisenhower era, the great powers within and outside the federal government had arranged for the certain transfer of leadership from Eisenhower to Richard Nixon. This was a natural course, but they miscalculated. Everything had been prepared for a smooth, uninterrupted transfer of that great power from Eisenhower to the Nixon era. This power elite was so certain of the electoral success that major programs such as the Make-War Vietnamese operations that have been going on for years, the TFX fighter plane procurement project at an estimated $6.5 billion, it was the largest aircraft procurement project ever devised up to that time, and many projects of similar nature were poised to come into fruition early in the planned Nixon period in order to continue the flow of hundreds of billions of dollars from the government to those industries. Clandestine operations that are employed to create make-war situations, wherever planned, and had increased in size and frequency during the last years of the Eisenhower term under the direction of John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, and his brother Allen Dulles, the Director of Central Intelligence. At the time of the election, there was on the shelf the Cuban Castro matter. There was the Chinese encroachment in Tibet with the impending threat to India. There was active trouble in Laos and Vietnam. And the largest of them all, the rebellion in Indonesia that had failed in 1958, in which, by the way, a Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald had been involved. lay in waiting for another flare-up at the proper time. These are all clandestine programs, and some of you may never have heard of any of them. But just think, in Indonesia, we were supporting 48,000 rebels. The Cuban brigade invasion was 1,200. We've heard an awful lot about the Cubans and not much about the Indonesians. These plans, worth hundreds of billions of dollars in military expenditures, and in those days that was a lot of money, were set. They had been prepared for a pliant Nixon, an experienced administration that he planned to inherit. Then came the campaign of '60, and up from nowhere came this impossibly youthful, Democratic, Catholic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy. And when the 66 million ballots had been counted, Kennedy had won by a margin of less than 0.5%. As an old-timer in the Pentagon, I sensed the disappointment and the fury of the incumbents. It happened that on the day before the Kennedy inauguration, while Washington was being blanketed in a raging blizzard, I was directed to go to Secretary Gates' office just before 5 o'clock with a last-minute item involving the Cuban Exile Training Program, better known later as the Bay of Pigs Zapata Project. My office was only a few doors down the hall, and I arrived at Mr. Gates' office around 5 to find an enormous crowd of well-wishers flooding his office to say goodbye. He'd been there for 6 years at that time. His outer office and the corridor were jammed. His secretary smiled at me as I mentioned my appointment. Looking at the huge crowd, she pointed to the door of his deputy. I went over there and looked in. He was alone. I walked in to find an old friend, Jim Douglas. He too had been around the Pentagon for, I think, 6 years at that time. I had been through countless meetings with him over those years. He smiled as I came in, rose from his desk, leaned against the windowsill looking at me, and over his shoulders I could barely see the city of Washington through the swirling snowflakes. Within a few minutes I had covered the subject of my business, and then I asked permission to ask a question. And he smiled. I said, "Mr. Douglas, ever since the Cuban exile program began earlier this year, it began, in the Eisenhower period, I have briefed you, or Mr. Gates, day by day. Tomorrow, when I come in with a similar briefing, may I expect that the new Kennedy men will have been made aware of this subject, or do I have to read them into the program back to BC?" Mr. Douglas turned slowly and looked toward the Potomac River and the White House obscured by snow, and then turned to me and he said, "Prouty, I'm damned if I know. We haven't met the bastards." Now, this may have been no more than an emotional response. I expect, though, that it was true. It accurately reflected the feelings of the long-term Eisenhower loyalists who were being removed from their offices by the new Kennedy upstarts, the whiz kids. Both sides had no desire to meet whatsoever. Now, such feelings give birth to pressures at the highest levels that smoldered into flame as the years roll by. The plans to remove Kennedy did not start in November '63, I will assure you. Shortly after Kennedy took office, the Bay of Pigs program became a disaster. At the same time, he was faced with a major decision concerning Vietnam. The very next day, he was faced with that. And following a lengthy and detailed Bay of Pigs investigation by the Cuban Study Group, Kennedy signed one of the most significant policy directives of his 1,000-day tenure. Yet, it is surprising how few people know about it, how little has been written about it, how little it is known. We all have heard that Kennedy had vowed to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces. But how many have ever heard how he planned to do it and what his formal policy had been established to achieve to reach that goal? In brief, on June 28, 1961, President Kennedy himself signed a National Security Action Memorandum, number 55. This important order was directed solely to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who at that time was General Lyman Limnitzer. Its subject, clearly stated, was, quote, "Relations of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the President in Cold War operations." In layman's terminology, Cold War operations meant clandestine operations. Kennedy opened the directive with memorable words. And really, if you know the structure of the bureaucracy of the Pentagon, you'd know that these words meant what they said 100-fold. Quote, this is Kennedy to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I wish to inform the Joint Chiefs of Staff as follows with regard to my views with their relation to me in the Cold War operations. Not just Cold War politics or Cold War what you have, Cold War operations. A, I regard the Joint Chiefs of Staff as my principal military advisor, responsible both for initiating advice to me for responding to requests for advice, and I expect their advice to come to me direct and unfiltered. And B, the Joint Chiefs of Staff have a responsibility for the defense of the nation in Cold War similar to that which they have in conventional hostilities. Unquote. From the Commander-in-Chief to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I'll assure you those are very strong words. I was the officer instructed to staff that paper because it was about clandestine activities, and two others, NSAM 56 and 57, and to brief the chairman and the chiefs of staff at their next meeting. First, they were surprised to discover that this order had been addressed directly to them and was signed by the President himself. It had not come through the Secretary of Defense. It had not been sent to other top addressees such as the Secretary of State or the Director of Central Intelligence. This procedure used by Kennedy for those words was rare, and it was extremely meaningful. Next, the chiefs were amazed to hear that the limits of their lawful function were being broadened to include Cold War operations. Needless to say, these policy statements created a great discussion and then were sealed top secret for further analysis and study. Interpreted as the President intended, this policy, if carried to its conclusion and not interrupted by his death, would have brought about an enormous change in the way the Vietnam situation was run, and that from 1945 to 63 had been under the operational control of CIA, not the military, in a way that would have been pursued. Without question, this new policy was the major stepping stone on a way to Kennedy's promise 2 years later that the bulk of all U.S. personnel would be out of Vietnam by the end of '65. He was not about to put Americans in Vietnam. This blunt statement of the Kennedy policy may have been the ultimate pressure point that created the climate in which the decision was reached to do away with the President. Another example highlights how this change impacted on the military-industrial complex directly, where they were most sensitive. During the last years of the Eisenhower era, the Air Force and Navy were deep in plans for new fighter aircraft. The Air Force proposal for a swing-wing fighter designated the TFX, and the processing for this procurement program had all but been completed during 1960, but the budget people bowed to Eisenhower's request to stay within the scope of his budget, so they moved the project into the 1961 Nixon term, as they expected. Everyone concerned knew that this project was a natural for the Boeing company and that it would begin at a $4 billion figure and then rise from there. The TFX was on the threshold, along with the Castro program, Vietnam, as the election came. But Kennedy won. McNamara entered the office of the Secretary of Defense, and Arthur Goldberg, a brilliant political strategist, became the Secretary of Labor. Between them, they came up with a procurement philosophy that would allocate that enormous sum of money in procurement to areas that were the most sensitive on the political map, as determined by Labor Department's voting patterns, where Kennedy's margin was the thinnest or where Nixon had defeated him. Pour the money in there and spread that out, so in '64, Kennedy would win hands down. McNamara announced a new round of studies, and the bidders were signaled that their production projects and subcontractors' physical plant locations should be spread over the most desirable array of county voting districts. So, finally, in November 1962, after delaying for nearly 2 years, McNamara announced the TFX award, which by that time included the Navy with all of its funding, and he assigned it to the General Dynamics Grumman team of bidders. Their proposal had been structured to approximate the Goldberg plan. The shock of that award, for the reasons mentioned, was absolutely terrific in the Pentagon and throughout the industrial complex. The TFX battle was fought in Congress well into '63. This gambit, along with other changes brought about during the Kennedy years, created the kind of opposition that really is beyond control. It just kind of smolders and begins to come up like a volcano that's about to happen. Increasingly, in the clubs and boardrooms of the wealthy, the powerful, the munitions makers, augmented by their bankers, their lawyers, voices began to rise as they mentioned that goddamn Kennedy and worse than that. In the halls of the Pentagon, in the CIA, other centrally affected areas, tensions rose. Finally, a consensus coalesced, and from that impersonal initiative, a decision was reached. Those few who know the methodology and the codes that activated what Lyndon Johnson called Murder Incorporated pushed the button. The deadly system then is set in motion, and like the deadly Gurkha scimitar, once it's drawn, it's never put back in the sheath without drawing blood. The time and the place was decided. You remember the scene from the movie. The intricate and detailed cover story was outlined and made ready. The cover story is tougher to create and carry out than the murder is under the systems that are used. And this cover story was not only for the day of the crime, but for years to follow, including 1993. The site was selected and prepared. The professional team moved into place and the elements of the plan went into effect. The carefully manipulated motorcade moved into position and the shots were fired. The news media interrupted ongoing programs right away. And I don't know how many have ever noticed it, but when something big happens, the first few seconds of news are usually very accurate. When CBS introduced its ongoing programs that day, here is what they said, quote, President Kennedy has been shot dead, gunned down during a drive through Dallas. 3 bursts of gunfire, apparently from automatic weapons, were heard. Have you ever heard of that come out of the Warren Commission report? That was the first news. Now, except for these first moments, that type of news was never heard, never repeated. Another thing they said, this was in the first news, Secret Service men immediately unslung their automatic weapons and pistols. There's no evidence that anything like that ever happened, and there's a lot of photographic evidence in that area right at that time. These same words were flashed around the world. The 1,000 days of the Kennedy era had come to an end. The greatest American coup d'etat, or the great American coup d'etat, had taken place. It was November 22nd, 1963, and the Pentagon Papers had no space to say one word about it. Here's a copy. I was in Christchurch, New Zealand. Here's a copy of the paper I bought in Christchurch, New Zealand. As soon as I could find a paper for sale, I wanted some news. I was with a congressman. We were both wondering what on earth had happened. Right here are the words, 3 bursts of gunfire, apparently from automatic weapons, were heard. This is all the way around the world to Christchurch now, and of course all around the world, not just to them. And then Secret Service men immediately unslung their automatic weapons and pistols. That we never heard anything about. But what interested me and the congressman that I was with was a picture of the building that had been flashed by radio photo in real time, just as fast as it'll go. And I turned to the congressman, I said, when we protect the president, we're under orders to close the windows. And look, even though it only shows part of the building, you can see all the windows that are open here. That's not done. You don't permit that in this kind of an operation. So just from this front page, thrown together very hastily down there in Christchurch, you could see that much that later on would lead you to be, at the time, we just believed what we read, of course. But here's something very, very interesting right here. Arrested man lived in Russia. Police have arrested a man employed at the building where a rifle was found after President Kennedy's assassination, British United Press reported. And here is a whole biographical review of Oswald's life, his service, his trip to Russia, his marriage to a Russian woman, etc. This paper with this story was on the streets before the police in Dallas had charged Oswald with the crime. By what authority or intuition were reporters writing a story like that to be sent around the world before the police could give them the name of the man or even enough evidence to have charged him with the crime? As you'll recall, he was arraigned at about 1:30 the next morning in Dallas. So even though this is a minor bit of evidence, it really is pretty shocking when you put it in the proper context. Thank you so much for your attention, and I would be delighted to listen to any questions that you might have. And I hope tomorrow to speak to some of you in a classroom. I'm wearing hearing aids, so I would appreciate those of you with good voices to sing out. If not, I want to get somebody who's got better ears than mine up here to translate. What do you have, sir?
The plot to assassinate Kennedy was started long before 1963. I'm curious how you feel about the first Kennedy's death in the plane crash. Was that just a coincidence, or maybe that happened? And also, if Joe Kennedy, Joe Sr., the father, had not had a stroke, they would not have been able to kill his son. Is there some way they could have instigated that as well? Was the plot deeper than knew beforehand?
Oh, that's a good question. He wants to know why I will say that Johnson was not part of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. And it's a good question because it comes up all the time. But now think, just let's, well, the thing goes on. I'll get used to this business yet. I taught at Yale for 4 years. I know these things. It's on? It's on. Hello. 1, 2. Maybe it's the wire. Okay, I'm sorry about that. The Johnson role. Let's think about that carefully. And we'll take a fix that we can all understand. When Stone came out with his movie, he was jumped on by people all over the country that really had no reason to do that. He's producing a drama, a dramatic movie from Hollywood, and there have been all kinds of movies from Hollywood, true and bad and indifferent and everything else. But people don't come out like that. But think with me, that is the evidence of how complete the cover story is that started even before Oswald is supposed to have shot the president, because they had written Oswald all up before he did. They had picked him ahead of time. They had set things up ahead of time. And it continues now. Now, could Lyndon Johnson be continuing a cover story in 1993? Could the Mafia be continuing a cover story in 1993? Let's use our heads. Where's the power in 1993?
Sure, he's dead now.
Who would?
Are you not familiar with the book that was just published recently, The Texas Connection, and what that author says about Lyndon Johnson in that book?
Yeah, I probably have been through as many of these things as anybody. I choose not to argue how many pins were stuck into the doll, because once the man's dead, then you have to go to the other facts. Because if it was a conspiracy, if you're not answering why, you're not getting there. And really, you have to discipline to that kind of thinking, or the next thing you go down in the mud. That's the object of a cover story. When I was running the clandestine operations for the military, my office was on this side of the hall. Across the hall, during all those 9 years, no matter where I worked, there was an office over there doing what we call cover and deception. And the guys in cover and deception were working twice as hard as I was. That's a hell of a job. Mine's simple. Because they had to have a cover story ready for everything that we did that was clandestine. You have to have plausible denial for everything that the government does. That was an order. And you have to think that way. If you're going to rob a bank downtown It's a heck of a lot better than to have 5 or 6 people here who know you and say you were here, and you couldn't have been robbing that bank because you're right here. So you create a cover story to protect yourself. And the government does that magnificently, or other power interests do. So you have to allow that the cover story is really the story of the crime. The crime is simple. I can tell you cases. I mean, it's unfortunate that I have to admit that I have worked on assassination. Fortunately, not in this country. And I know where the people have been kept. I don't know today. But I know enough about that to know that it's no offhand deal. But as a result, the killing really is the simplest part of it. It's the... the same methodology.
Right.
There were times when Anwar Sadat doesn't mean that much to us or somebody else, but the methodology, I mean, after all, in this state, if somebody commits a murder, there is somewhere a person who pulls the switch on an electric chair. That's a very unpleasant job, but it's a job. So what's really so different, except an order of magnitude, of people trained to use guns to kill people that somebody in power wants killed? And that's nothing new.
You stated that all the presidents since Kennedy supported the findings of the Warren Commission, and you said that they were told to do that. I'd like to know who are they?
So would I.
And also, why do they feel a need to propagate the findings 30 years after the fact?
Because they didn't kill Kennedy to kill Kennedy. They killed Kennedy to take over the government. When you take over the government, you don't want it for one day, or 1 year, or 10 years. Where do we stop? I mean, let's be realistic. I mean, it's big business. This is a big game. And Eisenhower outlined it so perfectly. And then Lyndon Johnson later came on and he said, you know, I was put in a box. I had to create that doggone commission. I never believed that stuff. And I had to do this and this. And I know they had a murder incorporated. Think what that means for an ex-president like Lyndon to be saying, and I bet you anything that the other presidents would be talking like that, or probably will in some book they'll write years to come. I mean, but this is not the usual game, people. This is, I don't think I would begin to understand if I hadn't been around that community for so long. Let's see what you...
I've got 3 or 4 questions I'll try to ask them real quick. In Mark Lane's book, Plausible Denial, he says that you saw a picture of your boss walking through Daily Plaza immediately after the assassination. Who was your boss and what was his reporting structure?
That's not Mark Lane's book. That's my book. The one you're holding in your hand, or what do you mean?
Yeah, this is different. Mark Lane's Plausible Denial. This is your book I just got, yeah.
Oh, excuse me. I got a little bit misled by that then. That I saw a picture of my boss. Yes.
Kind of a backside view of your boss walking through Daily Plaza. He was a desk, he was supposed to be desk bound in the Pentagon. Who was that, and did he report up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
The man who shows up in a picture, what he's talking about is a picture of the tramps, and probably some of you are familiar with what we call the tramps going across Dealey Plaza right after Kennedy was killed. These men are being led across under the claim that they were taken out of a freight car on the basis that they were going to escape after shooting the president, being led by 2 Dallas policemen who are in stage uniforms. They aren't even Dallas police uniforms. Both the policemen are kind of casually carrying shotguns. None of the men have handcuffs on, but the idea of the series of pictures that were printed everywhere was that these are the men that the police pulled out of a freight car, and obviously they're connected. Very strangely, in the first of those pictures, there is a man in a business suit walking sort of almost, on the other side of the sidewalk from these men, and he shows no interest in them whatsoever. He's just walking, and this is about 10 minutes, 12 minutes after the president is killed, and he's just walking along down the street while this funny-looking little parade goes by. He wasn't even interested. So the first time I saw that picture, I thought, that's a strange thing for a person to be doing right at this time. How on earth? Everybody else was running here, running there, watching, and in other places, loads of people were watching these people. Then I looked at this guy rather carefully, and I got a magnifying glass, and he's a person I know. Then when Jim Garrison wrote his book on the Trail of Assassin, he put that picture in his book. And again, the picture hit me in the face. I said, I know that guy. So I got copies of the picture, and I started sending it to associates, saying, I think I can identify some of the tramps. Do you recollect any of them from our work together? And in every case, the answer I got was, nothing to do with the tramps. It's the guy in the suit that wasn't even looking at him. And they said, that is General Ed Lansdale. Well, we know that Howard Hunt from the CIA was in Dallas. And we have found out rather recently that Lansdale had stubs of his hotel bill from the Fort Worth Hotel, the same hotel the Kennedy people stayed in the night before the murder. Those have been obtained by researchers who went to the, I believe, Stanford University records where Lansdale Papers are, and they found the stubs there, Fort Worth Hotel, same hotel. So these things have cropped up. They don't incriminate anybody other than the fact the man's there.
Where did he say he was supposed to be?
Pardon?
Has he ever been asked where he was supposed to be?
He's dead.
Howard Hunt was asked, so.
Yeah, and he was there, see? But think carefully now why they would be there and even permit themselves to be photographed when the murderers are being gone, see? It is to distract attention. Their job is cover story. They don't mind being photographed. They can say a million things, you know, that they were down there on official duty. I have been sent to places on official duty for, quote, protection of the president. So obviously I would be caught in pictures in an area where the president was. That's a business. That's a role that the military plays to augment the Secret Service.
Who was he exactly?
Who was what?
Who was Lansdale exactly?
He was a CIA man.
He was just an operative.
Well, he was a career CIA man. He's the man that overthrew the government of the Philippines way back in '52. He was the man that created Ngo Dinh Diem as the president of Vietnam. He's the man that ran the Saigon military mission that got Diem into Vietnam. He's a very, very prominent person.
He's a high-level CIA official.
Yeah. However, he wore the uniform of an Air Force Major General. And interestingly, he had resigned, quotes, technically, on the 23rd of October, 1963, from his Air Force job, which was in the Pentagon. But of course, that didn't mean he was out of the CIA, because the Air Force job was just a cover story. Yes, sir?
Ask you about Nixon. If it was Kennedy, they shot both the Kennedys, why did they have to humiliate Nixon to get him out of there? Did he refuse to play up until the early 70s to extend the war?
You know, Nixon was in Dallas when Kennedy was shot, at the moment, not the day before. He was there the day before, but he was there at the moment Kennedy was shot. And this is an interesting thing, because I have 4 books at home written by credible writers. One of them is this book, The Day Kennedy Was Shot, with a lot of details. And every one of them says that upon interviewing Nixon, he made the story. In one case, I don't remember where I was, but in the other 3, he was at LaGuardia Airport, having just arrived from the flight in the early morning, and the other 2 are something like that related, but they all vary from each other. They're not the same. I can tell you what foot I was standing on when I heard the news. You know, geez, you hear that news, and anybody can. So there's something strange about Nixon in that period.
Let me ask you about George Bush and go back to Bay of Pigs with Zepeda. Was the ships that they were on called the Barbara and the Houston?
Yes. When they asked for ships to carry the trucks and the weapons and the people down to the Bay of Pigs, they came to my office simply because that's a function of the job, and asked for 2 landing craft tanks. So I called the Navy, and they said, we got 2 up in Philadelphia. We took them down to Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which is at that time a closed base. And so we went to work on them. Well, you can't take Navy ships and something like that because of plausible denial, so we repainted them. We got done painting them. Some guy said, hey, commercial ships all have names on instead of numbers. And for reasons that none of us know and in that time didn't even think about, they painted a name on one of them, Houston. They painted a name on the other one, Barbara. And of course, the project was Zapata. Well, Bush was president of Zapata Oil. His wife was Barbara, and he lived in Houston. But that's all, it's all true enough, but it's part of the mythology. Yes, sir?
2 questions. One, what would happen to the actual hit team after they made their hit? Would they be liquidated? Because, I mean, this is a very significant hit.
No, I told you, it's not an ad hoc job. It's a continuing job. And they would, the way for them to leave would be so cleanly prepared as it was. Nobody would ever know they have been there. No one has ever seen them. And I can tell you from experience that they live overseas. you can take it from there, because nobody's ever found them. They have no faces that anybody would ever know, but it's a permanent job. They might have been sent on another job the next week.
It doesn't take just one of those people to come forward and later, 20 years later they feel guilty, or people like that have no excuse and they never come forward.
No, you know, really, I like the question, because you know what it is? It's a truly American question about why hasn't somebody broken out and told us this? I don't think it's possible for most Americans to believe how things like this are done, even historically. You know, if one of those men is given a job to go to, we'll say, Manila, and he gets in a bar there, and while he meets another guy, and they get talking, and he says, you know, I was in on this hit that we got Trujillo back in '58. By God, that was a clean job. As soon as he gets back to this beautiful little resort where he lives, where his wife is, where his family is, where they go to school and all that, there's an empty house, and a gun goes off as he comes in the driveway. He's through. This is a tough business.
Americans fix the guy in the White House might have to come up and save the day and tell the truth or something.
Yeah, you're right. But you see, there is a mentality, and I should even say more than that, it's a tradition of how to do these things. Because the people that do it have to win. You know, there is no trial. Again, they have never prosecuted these hitmen and never will. Even though Johnson said they knew they existed, why didn't he, the president, do something about it? Because, for one thing, they're out of reach of any of our law people. And you can go on and on, but you study this historically, and you read Nero's book, Glimpses of the Past, and see what this is a profession, unfortunately. How about somebody back there? What do you say?
Okay. In the movie, your character, Donald Sutherland, is supposed to be based on, the character talked about a teletype that was sent to every FBI office across the country saying that there was a threat against Kennedy's life in Dallas or some other city, and that all of those teletypes supposedly disappeared the next day. Did you know about that teletype?
There is good evidence that this teletype was sent. And people say they have seen it and that sort of thing. I'm not an expert on it, so I'm not talking to you as though it was something I saw myself, like the papers I was talking about. But apparently, some people in the FBI had got some idea that Kennedy might be killed during that trip through Texas. And some kind of a teletype went out, but it was practically ignored or disregarded, as you can see, because they didn't do anything about it. Frankly, I only know from reading or what I hear about that, but your point is one that is often repeated.
Also, I was just wondering, I remember reading about the film, about the JFK film, months before it was even starting to be made. They'd signed Kevin Costner to do the film, and they were saying about how they had to reconstruct a set to film the assassination on because Dealey Plaza didn't exist anymore. I was wondering if you knew how quickly that it disappeared after the assassination.
Well, they had to reconstruct certain things to be of that time, of course. For instance, I don't know if any of you noticed it, the New Zealand airport that took part in the film is Washington National Airport. And strangely enough, the architectural design of the buildings is almost identical. But they had to rebuild halls in other government buildings to look like Pentagon halls. That's movie making. And of course, Dealey Plaza has changed since 1963. That was one of the jobs of the film, was to bring it up to date. Sir?
Was the Watergate break-in related in any way to the Kennedy assassination? In other words, were they looking for papers concerning that?
I may have missed the first part.
Was what the Watergate break-in?
Yeah.
Was that involved? Was that related possibly to the Kennedy assassination?
I would think that's a pretty long connection. There were plenty of other reasons in that period. Now, coming close to what you're getting at, though, is that Chuck Colson, Nixon's counsel, had hired his old college friend from Brown University, Howard Hunt, for the purpose of having Hunt go into the White House files and forge Kennedy papers, master papers, that would show that Kennedy ordered Diem's assassination and not that it happened the way it did. And in the process, when the Watergate thing broke, we uncovered that testimony and backed it back through. But that's what they had been doing, falsifying records. Now, when you do that, you have to hunt around and try to find records that you can use to replace the ones to make them look very real. Now, whether those two things go together or not is rather hypothetical, but that was a period when the falsification of Kennedy records, just like I told you about the Bay of Pigs, that is a falsification of the Kennedy period. Of the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers are a purposeful falsification of the Vietnam record. So the sources for those could have come from many places, and in that sense, you're very correct. I can't say what the object of the break-in was at the Watergate building. No. Yes, sir?
Is there an economic reason for us being in Vietnam besides a military complex, oil or something?
Well, in a traditional sense, when an area like Vietnam is potentially very profitable and has an awful lot of oil down there, and after World War II, when Roosevelt had told Churchill, among others, that they were going to have to divest themselves of colonies in Asia, France, Holland, and the Netherlands, and England, obviously it's going to create a vacuum that somebody wants to move into because everything is so potentially valuable. There are enormous oil fields off the coast of Vietnam. Another thing, Vietnam used to export on an average 600,000 tons of rice a year. Well, that's grown in Mississippi and Louisiana now. So Michelin tires used to be made from the rubber trees in Vietnam, which Agent Orange wiped out. Now Michelin makes their tires in South Carolina. So there's a lot of business things come up in these, and of course you never know which one was the decision, but I can clue you, all together, they are decisions that make the world we live in today. There's no question about that. Let's try one back there. Yes, young lady.
In light of what you're saying, do you feel that democracy in this country has a future?
No, you know, I feel a little bit successful having that question come in, because really I'm more worried about that side of what we're talking about than exactly the weight of the magic bullet. Because really, if we can go for 30 years without being able to break the cover story that covers this ridiculous thing that Oswald killed Kennedy, are we really running this place? You see? Are our presidents really running this place? Why is it that Ronald Reagan or George Bush or the rest of, will say that Oswald killed Kennedy? How many in this room still believe that Oswald killed Kennedy? And I respect any of you that want to say that. But no, all right, good. See?
I think yours is entirely circumstantial evidence. What you're saying.
Yeah, all right. But you see, I think, and from the experience I've had now since this movie put this all out into the open, I think there's room at least to begin to believe that there were reasons for the death of the president, not just that some nut fired at him because he was in range of his gun. And that affects democracy deeply. In the back row up there. Yes?
Do you really think that Oswald, taking it one step further with Oswald, people say that he was involved limitedly with the conspiracy? Do you think he was involved at all?
Let me just answer your question a little bit by, was Oswald involved even at all? Let me just go back just a little bit. The system that we ran in the military to support CIA required us to select military people who would then fill roles within the structure of the CIA for functions that were really military, like operating radar units, for maintaining helicopters and all the rest, so that we worked very closely together. However, when we assigned men from the services, whichever service, first of all, we made it sure that they were volunteering for the service. Secondly, they had to go through the regular FBI, CIA clearances for loyalty and all that sort of thing. And those clearances, even for a military man, take months to go through. Now, Oswald was assigned to the Atsugi base in Japan, which is the senior CIA base in the Far East. He was an active duty Marine. He had been through all of the military's qualifications for such a job, including language training, which was a requirement of the job, and radar training. He had gone through all of the CIA background training to get there. And I can tell you from having worked within that system, in fact, having run the system for 9 years, that the people that were selected by the different services were, with almost exception, without exception, top people. Why else choose otherwise? Because they're on very open jobs. And I'm not trying to make fun of any certain person, but look what happened to Ollie North, who was in a very similar job, a military man assigned to do covert activities. I mean, just take a few steps off base and you're right in the headlines. So, unless there's something real special about Oswald that somebody thinks he knows that the system didn't know, I would just tell you, because I'm familiar with thousands of men, we had an average of 5,000 men in these jobs year in, year out in all the services, that the people selected were, first of all, professionally competent and passed all the security tests that we could think of in the country, same as we do to our top level people. So it has never crossed my mind that Oswald was not a fit Marine for his duties at Atsugi. He was selected for duties in this strenuous campaign in Indonesia. Then he came back and so on. I think he was a created patsy for the job, and unless I could hear facts otherwise, I accept that. Yes, sir.
Are you aware of any link between Clay Shaw, the International Trademark, Permandex, and the Special Operations Executive of British Intelligence?
Now, in talking about Clay Shaw and any other materials of the Garrison trial, which I'm sure you're referring to, I must underscore that I was not a screenwriter, nor was I responsible for the Garrison material that developed through the movie. But I do know
about Clay Shaw as a CIA agent working with Bannister, but more than that, in big business. He was involved in international work, which many people do for the CIA, whether they're even career members of the CIA or what we call contract members of the CIA. Clay Shaw was mixed up with the CIA, and there's no question about that. Whether Garrison had enough evidence to link Clay Shaw's role with the CIA and with FBI people like Bannister to tie him into the Kennedy conspiracy is something that, well, the court didn't buy it, which may mean something, but it's always a question. But Clay Shaw is an important figure, no question about that. Yes?
What do you suppose this assassin group thinks about Clinton and his budget cuts?
Who was that? This group?
Well, the group of assassins that you're referring to,
yeah.
Unknown people.
Okay.
What do you suppose they think of Clinton and his big budget cuts with the defense?
Okay. You watch pro football once in a while. And once in a while somebody breaks somebody's leg. It's part of the game, isn't it? Well, these people are in that kind of a highly skilled game in which people get hurt. So if they don't like it, they got to get the heck out, and if they can. But it's not that kind of a game. They're in it, and it's for real. And they make it as impersonal as possible, because most of the time when they leave to a destination where all they know is that they're going to a destination, that they're going to stand in a certain sewer, and the top will be raised for them, and they fire the gun and they go, they probably don't even know who the target is. But of course, most sane people would know. But these are foreigners, a lot of them. A lot of them are not Americans. They're doing a job for which they're well paid and well trained. So you see, your question gets to be a little bit hypothetical. However, it's a very human question. Yeah.
To me, when I
get into that box, I always think, you know, why does the man who pulls the switch for the electric chair go back for the next one? I mean, I don't think I could do it. You know, I might be awfully angry at the guy, but so I can't really answer the question. But there always have been people in that kind of a role as far back as you can read civilization. Yes.
Seems that back at that time, the American people were easily placated by this frontier justice of Lee Harvey Oswald and then Jack Ruby killing Lee Harvey Oswald. Wasn't there any ever sort of spotlight placed on Ruby to find out what his side of the story was? From what I understand, he was never put on trial. He never spoke to the public. Is that correct?
You know, there's one of the most interesting things about Ruby is the time when he was visited by Warren. And as it's recorded, he pleaded with Warren to take him to Washington, saying, I can't tell you my story here in Dallas, but take me to Washington and I'll talk to you. Now, that could be an amplification of more cover story, or it could have been the man's real belief. He's a very complex figure in this thing because you almost feel there was no role for him except he made a role, or there was some very strange use of him for a necessary function, is to get rid of Oswald. But of all times to do it in the middle of a police station with nationwide TV.
Because of that, because Oswald never had a chance to defend himself and argue his position, and then Ruby comes in and he's cut off. So it looks like there's some sort of a mob tie or some sort of a big payoff involved there.
Well,
I have asked many experts, and I hope if there are any of you here, I'd like to have you consider the same question. I have gone to Fort Detrick, where we test small arms weapons many, many times. And for example, they come up with a new revolver, a bullet weight that's a little better than the other one, or something else, fragmentation or something. And they tie up a goat, which has a body something like ours, and they fire at the goat. And I've seen him hit a goat in the shoulder and see his foot fly off from a bullet. Now think back. How many of you have seen the TV picture when Ruby is coming at a crouch up to Oswald's stomach with the revolver, two policemen holding Oswald from either side, and he fires? Did Oswald's foot fly off? Did any of his hands even move? Did anything move? Police bullets are built to make a person fly through the air, to tear his body apart. They're special developments. I don't want to be humorous here, but frankly, myself, having taken part in a lot of that testing, I'm just wondering if that little scene could have been part of a story. And I wouldn't dare write about it, and I don't know enough about it. But I have seen bullets hit living objects. Remember the amazing picture at the time Reagan was shot at? And this Secret Service man was flying in the air, his hands were out like that, he was above the sidewalk because he had been hit by a bullet. Oswald didn't even move, except he was crouched like that, but he never moved. You've all seen it on TV. Where'd the bullet go?
Be removed so George Bush could be president, and that failed. It took the Secret Service 15 minutes and not to find a hospital. That sounds pretty.
I think we'll stick to
tonight's story. Well, I will tell you something. Because of my business, a lot of people know me and call me. I was in my office in Washington, and really within minutes, I got a call from a young man that said Reagan had just been shot. The interesting thing was he was part of the ABC TV crew that took the pictures. And he called me right away because we knew each other, and he said, I just can't believe it. He said, I saw people fall, but he said, I don't think they hit the president at all. And he was right there. Furthermore, the driver of the car, drove back to the White House. And it was when he got downtown that they said, hey, go to the hospital. Now, these are things I heard within minutes from people I've known for a long time. So there's a lot of stories that are very incomplete in the places we read them or that we don't read. Yes, sir?
Who was the manager, the contract manager that liquidated President Diem in Korea?
The assassination of Diem was, and this is approved by, what I'm about to tell you is verified by the man who was running the project for Ambassador Lodge, a man named Lou Cornyn, who oddly enough was the same man who in 1945 had been with General Gallagher when Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of Vietnam, which makes it kind of interesting. But he was the assigned U.S. representative to work with the men who were planning the coup. But the coup was being planned with great care by Ambassador Lodge. And there was an airplane at Tan Son Nhut, the airport, to pick up Diem and his brother and to fly them to Yugoslavia, where he was going to make a speech at the Interparliamentary Union. Diem and his brother, his wife had already gone into Madame New, had gone to Europe. His other brother, who was an archbishop, had been called to Rome by the Pope. So the Diems were going to be all out of the country as soon as that plane took off. For some reason that the people right on the spot could not explain, the two Diem brothers went onto this plane, a big Super Constellation, that was a foreign airline on contract to the U.S. government, and then came off and got back into their car and went back to the White Palace. Before it dawned on them that when they got back to White Palace, there was nobody there. I mean, their guard was hated in the city. When they're gone, their guard ran. There was nobody there. Realizing what had happened, they went into a tunnel that had been prearranged years ago. They went under the river to Cholon, on the other side of the river. They got out in Cholon, and they went into a church, thinking if anything happened, that would be the last sanctuary they'd have, because they were alone. They were captured there by some of the generals, or some of the people who were working for the generals, that had been ready to take over the government with the flight of the Diems, but a bloodless flight, in the plane and gone. That was the plan laid on by Lodge and the people here, and approved by Kennedy. My boss was a member of that. And I will never forget my boss coming back from the White House, calling me in his office in the Pentagon, and he said, you know, we can't explain it. It failed. They're dead. And that's how it happened. But it was the driver of the vehicle that they were being transported in had another man with him who killed the Diems in the vehicle. So they were assassinated by the new people in Vietnam. But that was not the U.S. plan, and there's all kinds of documentation, including a lot of people who are still living who can tell you that straight out. Sir?
What do you think Oswald was expecting? Was he expecting a cushy jail sentence? Or was he expecting to flee the country at some point? Or what if Oswald was an operative, was part of the cover story behind the assassination, what was he expecting? Was he expecting to be taken care of?
What he told the policeman, I believe, is absolutely true. He said, I didn't even know the president was dead. I mean, there was no other way for him to you know, you don't tell a guy things like that. If you tell a man that he's going to be the patsy, he's going to start running right then.
He assumed that he was going to be taken care of.
Well, they picked him up, you know, on the suspicion of killing the policeman. That's why a policeman in Dallas was sacrificed. Well, he knew the policeman had been killed because they picked him up, and here they show him the police car not too far from the theater. He knew that they thought that he was somehow involved in that, even though he denied that, of course. Well, all the rest of that day, every time he was told anything, and of course they didn't do much with him, it was about the policeman. He was first arraigned by the police for the murder of that policeman. Then that was in the evening of the day Kennedy was killed. It was only the next day when finally they figured they had enough stuff worked up to say he is the man we're holding allegedly for killing the president. Then, of course, that same morning he was killed, so their problem was removed. Oh, I don't think Oswald had the slightest idea that he was involved in this thing until when he got back in the police station. He said a newspaper reporter was the first one that told him that the president was dead.
Yeah.
In the book, Kiss the Boys Goodbye, I don't know if you've read the book, but the authors lay down a very detailed account of the power struggle between CIA brass and Raker military brass in Vietnam while Nixon and Kissinger were trying to get peace talks going with Vietnam. And the bottom line was the CIA, who had really run the Vietnam War for the Americans for many, many years, won the power struggle and threw away our POW and MIAs, in effect, because to CIA people, if you're caught out in the field, you're a throwaway person, just the opposite of military conventional wisdom. How many POWs and MIA do you think we knowingly threw away after the Nixon and Kissinger peace accords?
Sir, you have opened up the greatest Pandora's box in the world, because just think a couple of things. We started fighting down there in September 45. We lost the first person dead in Vietnam. How many people remember went back that far? September 45. And from 45 until the Marines land on a beach in Vietnam in 65, 20 years, everything that was done in Vietnam, give or take the ambassador and the military aid program, which is always a military program, no matter what country it's in, was under what we call the operational control of the CIA. If we had some helicopters down there that were military, as soon as they were on orders to go there, we would, what we call, sanitize them, take all military ID off them. We would send civilians to fly them, civilians to maintain them, under the operational control of the CIA. That's a technique that goes on today, and that's the technique that was established by National Security Action Memorandum, NSC Directive 5412 in March of 1954, which goes a long way back. Now, with that in mind, anybody that was lost between 45 and 65 was working for the CIA. He's a spy by definition in any country in the world. There is no Geneva Convention for people operating in the intelligence community, and they know that. That's why I told this other gentleman that before we sent anybody, Oswald or anybody else, to that kind of duty, he had to be a volunteer. And in the process, we had to tell him what that meant. Because if he was captured, just like Gary Powers in the U-2, a spy, not an Air Force captain, even though he had an Air Force captain's credentials in his pocket, he were working for the CIA. Now, under those conditions, then, when did the war in Vietnam start? The Tonkin Agreement was not really a declaration of war. So you know, internationally, you have to do things according to the accords that exist in the world. We never went to war with Laos. So if a Navy fighter pilot crashed in Laos, like the son of my good friend George Brooks, he's not a prisoner of war, he just happened to crash in Laos. Now, of course, I understand what all of you think about that, but think about this. Every military man has a pretty big insurance contract on him. When the League of Families was formed in 1970, one of the leading people in the group was a person from the Reinsurance Corporation of America. Because when a man is missing in action, by definition, he's not dead. If he's not dead, you don't have to pay off his insurance policy. And if you have thousands of those people, you don't have to pay off thousands of insurance policies. Plus the fact the family continues to get to pay. So, for many, many reasons, the family is not interested in having their loved ones declared dead. The pay is sufficient to keep them going for time. And the insurance industry doesn't have to pay the overhang of this hundreds of millions of dollars of insurance. Now, these are just practical matters. But the Stevensons never gave it a thought. The other side is, if you're a POW and you go down and you're declared dead, the insurance has to be paid. But unless it was later in the war, when things were organized somewhat, even POWs were an implausible way to define the people that were there. For instance, the Vietcong as an enemy in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, a country that didn't exist until after 1954, until the middle of 54. The Vietcong were just little people running around the country shooting, but they weren't signatories to any agreement to take care of POWs, MIAs, or anything else. They were fighting for food and for their own existence. So that trying to stratify POWs and MIAs and all the rest with all of this thing involved really is one of the most amazing bits of news reporting that I've ever known. And I might as well be frank and tell you that when this League of Families, Southeast Asia, for prisoners of war in Southeast Asia was formed early in 1970, I was the first man called by the general in the Pentagon, because you see the military had always carried on that role when it was like a real war. And they said, look, we've got this strange thing to create. You have worked on POW programs, and I had, both in World War II and in the Korean War. You go on this committee. I was a vice president of a bank then, as the finance advisor to the committee, and report to us every time something comes up that we need to know. It was a very strange organization. Very fine people, mothers, wives, fathers, all. but they didn't comprehend the complexity of these things, nor did the Stevensons. And we keep reading about these mysterious things about MIAs. And people. Did you ever hear in the Vietnam days that there was a bank called Nguyen Han Bank that all of a sudden blossomed up to being worth over $1 billion? It was an Australian bank, but it really operated in Saigon, but it had worldwide offices, everyone headed by either an admiral or a general. One day, Frank Hand, an Australian, was found dead in his car, suicide of course, and Michael Hand, a CIA man, who was the other half of the Nguyen Han business, has never been seen since. Now Mike Hand is MIA. Mike Hand probably got away with $300 or $400 million. He said he's never coming home. Well, there's a lot, that's a rare case, a very individual case. But people that think seriously about the POW MIA program really have to put it on bedrock, realize that it's a ball of yarn all twined up, and that if you're going to try to solve one of the cases or another one, you have to treat it individually, and then remember that there are enormously powerful groups behind the positions that have been taken ever since 1970, and it's not at all what you've been reading. It's really a terrible chapter of our history. Back in the back row there.
You were either anointed by the people or empowered by the government with unlimited powers, and you were charged with totally reinvestigating the whole Kennedy issue. And everybody that you spoke to who was alive today had to tell you the truth. Who are the first three people you'd want to talk to?
About the death of Kennedy? There's a club downtown Washington called the Metropolitan Club, and it'll do for stage setting. I'd sit in the corner and listen to some of the echoes from September, October, November 1963. And among those echoes, I'd probably hear 20 or 30 voices yelling at each other, and by God, we'll get him. And if I could recognize any of them, and I think I could, those would be my first people. See, they're nothing to do with the government, if you see what I mean. Too powerful for that. Yes. Regrettably, and I say this properly because Oliver Stone and quite a few other people and myself did a lot of talking about this, because once you break an egg, you can't put it back. And we knew we were going to break that egg because people have to start thinking about this. We have got to do something about this.
We didn't do it last November.
Question. Is the CIA, to the best of your knowledge, involved in bringing illicit drugs into the United States and distributing and using the profit for that to fund their illegal activities?
Well, that's an everyday question. What's his name here? Westmoreland on your radio talking to me about that today. The CIA operated, in my days, probably the largest airline corporation in the world, with all types of aircraft, many of them very special airplanes. When you do something like that, the airline has rather unlimited powers, because the countries it operates in, it has to appear to be in business. You can't have them flying airplanes in and out and not selling any tickets. Right away you blow who's running the thing. So in the Far East they had an airline called Civil Air Transport, incorporated in Taipei, and flying lines through Vietnam, into Bangkok, into Laos, into Burma, all around. And as a result, they had a lot of trained pilots and many planes. In the process of that kind of work, it's inevitable that some of the boxes have got stuff in it that isn't what you thought it was. For instance, a lot of the stories that would run around in Laos, we were operating with a strange little airplane designed by MIT called a Helio. And it could land almost on this thing here, but it's a rather conventional plane. And we had hundreds of them. So the story I used to hear from some of the pilots was a rather plaintive story. They'd say, you know, I got to be friends with some of these Chinese who used to be with Chiang Kai-shek, and he's been defeated, and now they're moving down into Laos and down into Thailand. And just one of these fellows came to me the other day and he said, you know, my dear mother just died. I hear she's just died, and she's up in such and such in China now. It's just a few miles across the line. I wonder if I maybe $5,000, you'd go up and get the coffin for me. So the coffin was full of little packages of white stuff. So he went up and got his mother many, many times. Well, that's the kind of thing you hear that is valid. You know, it happens. It's not just limited. Another thing, though, that is very practical in that question. During World War II, when he had the Burma campaign, the U.S. Army had a division in Burma, and there was a Chinese division in Burma supporting the U.S. Army. We couldn't get that many troops into Burma at that time without taking them out of Europe, where we needed them. And so the U.S. paymasters, who would come up to the Army with the old wooden footlockers you're all familiar with dollar signs on it, and they'd open up the footlocker and hand each soldier his pay for the month, had more boxes with a dollar sign on them, and open that box, and little white packages, you know, heroin, because the Chinese division was paid in heroin. It's customary. Now, this is the U.S. paymaster with the heroin. Where did he get it in 1944? He never ran out of it. So some of these same paymasters, some of the same men that were in Burma were the first ones that went into the Vietnam arena in 1955, 1950, the late 40s. They just carried their job from Burma in there. And of course the source of heroin was still the same thing. But in Burma it was done as a function of their duties with the U.S. Army. And so I don't know how you translate that when you move it over into Vietnam and it's under CIA. I imagine you keep, you know, it's still a government function. Pardon?
General Bo Grice, what he has to say about the CIA and they're bringing drugs into this country. Do you not believe what he says?
What's that now? I was with Bo the day before yesterday. What are we talking about?
Bo was saying in his book that the CIA brings in drugs into this country, heroin and cocaine, and it's all very organized.
That they do bring them in here?
Say something.
Well, I'm talking about...
When he's asking about the CIA bringing drugs into this country, isn't that what Bo is saying? That Bo is making claims?
Oh, I thought you meant for the government. You know,
which country? It matters.
The United States, the CIA deliberately brings drugs in from other countries into the United States and distributes them throughout this country.
You can bring most anything in proprietary aircraft. I mean, almost anything will come in.